Imagine you're a medieval explorer standing on the edge of the known world. In the 15th century, for a Portuguese mariner sailing west from Lisbon, that edge was a terrifying, empty expanse of gray-blue Atlantic water. But out in that void, some 1,000 miles from the European coast, a miracle of geology had punched through the ocean's surface. A tiny cluster of 9 volcanic islands, the Azores, lay scattered across the seam, where 3 of Earth's tectonic plates grind together. The smallest, northernmost, and most remote of them all was Corvo, and this island would harbor a startling secret. Corvo isn't so much an island as it is the jagged crown of a single colossal submarine volcano named Monte Gordo, a lonely outpost on the North American plate. It's a place of profound isolation, a mere 7 square miles of rock and pasture that today is home to just over 400 souls. This is a place built by fire and water, seemingly untouched by human hands. And that is precisely why the first Portuguese explorers, upon making landfall here in the mid-15th century, were confronted with an impossibility. On this desolate, windswept island, which all logic dictated should be empty, they found something that defied every expectation. It was a sophisticated work of art, an equestrian statue, carved from stone, its silent rider gazing resolutely west, pointing toward the vast, terrifying unknown that lay beyond the horizon. This enigmatic entity would come to be known as the Horseman of Corvo. The story of the statue could have easily dissolved into the mists of maritime folklore, were it not for one man, Damião de Goss. Goss was no mere spinner of yarns. He was a respected humanist, a well-traveled diplomat, and crucially, the head archivist of the Portuguese Royal Archives. His word carried immense weight, and when he included the statue in his 1567 Chronicle of Prince John, he wasn't recording rumor, but what he believed to be fact. His account is striking for its journalistic specificity. He describes a statue carved from a single slab of stone, depicting a man on horseback. The rider wore a cloak. His left hand rested calmly on the horse's mane, while his right arm was extended, pointing westward. Notably, the clothing the man was wearing was described as North African in nature, which to the Portuguese of the time suggested a Carthaginian origin, or perhaps a later Moorish origin. Below the statue, etched into the stone base, were letters from an alphabet none of the sailors recognized. Goss even recorded a later attempt to decipher this script, adding further weight to this tale. In 1529, a sea captain named Pero da Fonseca was told by locals that men had attempted to press wax against the inscription and send it back to the mainland for scholarly analysis. However, this was unsuccessful, as the inscription was long faded from the elements. Goss placed the monument on the northwestern side of Corvo's mountain, in a location he explicitly states was dangerous and difficult to access. This level of detail is compelling, and it doesn't read like a myth, which tends to be fluid and vague. Rather, it reads like a report. The precision of the description, the clothing, the exact posture, and the specific gesture suggests Goss was working from a source he trusted. The very inclusion of such mundane details gives the extraordinary claim the potential ring of authenticity. The very mundanity of the details, especially the frustrating and failed attempts to understand the inscription, gives the extraordinary claim a powerful and unsettling ring of authenticity. The discovery of such an anomaly at the edge of the known world did not go unnoticed. The news reached the court of King Manuel I. Manuel was a man obsessed with legacy, and he was a great patron of the arts and architecture. He was also the sponsor of the great voyages of discovery, and the wealth of empire flowed into his coffers, making him one of the richest monarchs in Europe. For such a king, An ancient statue like this was something that could either challenge or amplify Portugal's own exploratory achievements. If it was placed there by Moorish sailors, it would make the Portuguese find much less impressive, as they were able to do it with similar technology. But if it was carved by the legendary sailors of Carthage, according to the logic of the time, this was more of a transfer of the mantle of exploratory supremacy than anything else. The Carthaginians were then, as they are known today, considered amongst the foremost mariners in world history, and it would have been no shame to be beaten anywhere by them. The king first dispatched a royal draftsman, Duarte de Armas, to create a detailed sketch of the monument. This was an act of documentation, a desire to understand the object before sending a full expedition to retrieve it. Tragically, that desire to possess would be the monument's undoing, if the sources are to be believed. After viewing the drawing, which has since been lost to history, King Manuel ordered the statue to be brought to Lisbon. An engineer from Porto, who had been trained in Italy and was considered the best at his trade, was sent with equipment to retrieve the artifact. Unfortunately, this Italian-trained engineer turned the mission into a complete catastrophe. The official report that returned to the king blamed a fierce winter storm for having shattered the statue. But Goss, ever the diligent historian, records a crucial and telling detail, which suggests that the engineer and his workers broke it through clumsiness. Only a few pathetic fragments, the heads of the man and the horse, a right arm, a piece of a leg, were salvaged and brought to Lisbon. They were reportedly kept in royal possession for a time before they vanished completely, leaving nothing behind but a story. In the centuries following the Horsemen of Corvo incident, Portugal's golden age would rapidly fade, and this maritime empire would hit some choppy waters. The story faded into history and had become a largely forgotten mystery. But in 1749, a new piece of the puzzle emerged, unearthed by a storm, and this would potentially support an ancient origin for this enigmatic statue. The tempest scoured the island's coast, uncovering the foundations of a ruined building, and within it, a black pottery vessel, and inside the pot was a hoard of coins. These coins eventually made their way to an academic who identified them as Carthaginian and Greek, and dated them to approximately 200 BC. Suddenly, the statue legend had what it always lacked: potential physical evidence that corroborated the story. The coin find seemed to potentially place sailors from the Carthaginian Empire on that very island at a plausible time. This Carthaginian hypothesis gained academic traction as they were known to depict their gods as horsemen. Furthermore, equestrian statues of the type described by Goss were popular in the Hellenistic period, which perfectly matched the date of the coins. The theory was exciting. The statue was a religious monument, or a territorial marker, left by ancient mariners who had pushed far out into the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. Unfortunately, however, these coins, like seemingly everything in this mysterious historical story, have been lost to time as well. Further, later modern discoveries would suggest that Vikings may have ventured to the island around the 9th century. It remains a distinct possibility that these Norsemen could have dumped off their glistening booty on the island, which was then lost to time. Of course, for every romantic theory, there's a skeptical counterargument. The most straightforward is that the statue never existed as a man-made object at all. Corvo is a volcanic island, littered with dramatic basalt formations. Skeptics argue that the so-called statue was likely a natural rock formation that, when viewed from a distance at sea, had the superficial appearance of a horse and rider. To a 15th century sailor, steeped in a world of myth and marvels, it's easy to imagine how such a geological curiosity could be interpreted as a deliberate sculpture. From there, as the island, which was previously completely uninhabited, was settled. The locals may have simply accepted this initial finding. Notably, some scholars have pointed to maps at the time which included figures with outstretched arms around the approximate location of the Azores. These were included not as legitimate markers, but as a "here be dragons" point on the map. It's been speculated that the initial report of seeing this figure was the mariners' way of saying they had reached the spot on the map with the outstretched arm. The theory suggests that this abstract symbol on a map may have been misinterpreted over the years, until chroniclers believed it represented a real, physical statue on an island. In this view, the legend was born not on the rocky cliffs of Corvo, but on the vellum of a cartographer's workshop, and over time, a rock structure was associated with the statue. For most of modern history, the debate remained at this impasse, and this is where we are right now. On one side was the highly credible, detailed account from a respected chronicler, which some scholars insist cannot be simply dismissed as a fairy tale. On the other was the complete and utter lack of any direct archaeological proof. Without the statue, the inscription, or even the drawing or the coins, most mainstream historians filed the story under unproven legend. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just taking a second to remind you to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications for my channel. Simply hitting subscribe doesn't guarantee you'll get any sort of notification for any video I post. Also, don't forget that you can support my channel for as little as $1 a month through the YouTube membership or the Patreon. A lone warrior, silhouetted against a full moon, his hand resting on the hilt of a long, curved sword. With a motion too fast for the eye to follow, the blade is free, a sliver of light that sings through the air. This is the samurai, and the katana is his soul. It's an image we know intimately, burned into our collective imagination by a century of media. We know this image from the Stoic heroes in Akira Kurosawa's masterpieces, all the way down to more popular forms of entertainment from both the East and the West. In these stories, the katana is more than a weapon. It's an artifact of impossible power, a blade so perfectly forged it can slice through steel, stone, or anything else that stands in its wielder's path. It represents the pinnacle of martial skill, a symbol of honor, discipline, and the warrior's very essence. But this powerful image, as compelling as it is largely a myth. For the majority of the samurai's history, their identity was not defined by the sword. On the chaotic battlefields of feudal Japan, a samurai who drew his katana was often in a desperate situation. It meant his primary weapon was gone, his bow was broken, his spear was lost, or the enemy was simply too close. The sword was a sidearm, a backup, a weapon of last resort. To truly understand the samurai, we have to look past the gleam of the famous blade and uncover the real arsenal that defined these legendary warriors. We must journey through history to see how combat evolved, what weapons truly dominated the field, and how the katana was transformed into the mythical soul of the samurai. For the first several centuries of their existence, from the Heian period through the Kamakura period, roughly the 10th to the 14th centuries, the sword was an afterthought. The defining creed of the samurai was not the way of the sword, but Kyuba no Michi, or the way of the horse and bow. The earliest samurai weren't swordsmen, but an elite class of mounted archers. These weren't simply highly mobile archers who sought better locations on horseback, but fired on foot. They practiced the art of mounted archery, the ability to fire accurately from a moving horse. As any fan of the history of steppe peoples such as the Mongols or the Kazakhs knows, this combination was unparalleled in pre-modern combat. These early samurai emerged from a need by the imperial court for a professional mobile military force capable of acting as a rapid response police force. They were tasked with putting down rebellions and hunting bandits across the provinces. For these tasks, the sword was of secondary importance, and a specialized longbow, along with the horse, reigned supreme over all else, and it wasn't even close. The primary weapon of this era was the yumi, a uniquely Japanese longbow. Often measuring over 2 meters in length, it was a marvel of engineering. Its most distinct feature was its asymmetry, and the grip was located about 2/3 of the way down the length of this specialized weapon. This ingenious design allowed a warrior on horseback to wield the massive weapon with deadly effect. The shorter lower limb could be maneuvered easily over the horse's neck and withers, while the long upper limb provided immense power. A samurai's training was dedicated to mastering this weapon, learning to string, draw, and fire with precision from a galloping horse. The historical record is unequivocal about the bow's dominance. Academic analysis of battlefield reports and reward petitions from the period reveals that arrows were overwhelmingly the primary cause of casualties. A warrior's prowess was measured by his skill as an archer, and battles were often initiated by volleys of whistling arrows. From there, these early samurai postured for the best positions on their horses while using their limited arrow supply only when openings were available. Even the samurai's iconic armor from this period was purpose-built for mounted archery. The samurai's entire identity, his social function, his martial culture, and his physical equipment was built around his role as an elite mounted archer. The sword was present, of course, but it was a secondary tool for a specialist whose most important work was done from a distance. Perhaps the best modern comparison would be a bayonet, which, like the early katana, was designed to be used only as a last resort. The dominance of the mounted archer, however, was not to last. The nature of conflict in Japan underwent a dramatic transformation during the turbulent Sengoku period. This period spanned from the mid-15th to the early 17th century, and is associated with names like Oda Nobunaga that are known even to those with little awareness of Japanese history. The relatively small-scale conflicts of the past gave way to massive campaigns involving tens of thousands of soldiers. In this new environment, the small corps of elite mounted archers became less effective, as there simply weren't enough mounted archers to make a difference. Unlike the steppe people like the Mongols, who were in essence born in the saddle, the samurai were a very small percentage of the fighting force on any battlefield. While the Mongols could field massive swarms of mounted archers raised up from even the lowest in their society, the Japanese could only raise this troop from the absolute upper echelon. During this period, the emphasis shifted to weapons that were better suited for disciplined formations and close-quarters infantry combat. The battlefield was now dominated by polearms. The primary weapon for both the samurai and the swelling ranks of common foot soldiers, or ashigaru, became the yari, the Japanese spear. Ranging from practical lengths for individual combat to enormous pikes over 15 feet long for formation fighting, the yari offered the crucial advantage of reach. A wall of spears could halt a cavalry charge, keep swordsmen at bay, and allow large, relatively disciplined units to dominate the field. Alongside the spear was the naginata, a long pole topped with a curved, sword-like blade. While it required more training to wield effectively, it was a devastating weapon capable of scything through enemy ranks, and was particularly favored by warrior monks. This evolution was accelerated by a technological revolution. In 1543, a Portuguese ship wrecked on the island of Tanegashima, introducing the matchlock musket to Japan. Japanese swordsmiths and metalworkers, renowned for their skill, quickly reverse-engineered the weapon. Within a few decades, Japan had become one of the world's foremost producers and users of muskets. Visionary warlords like Oda Nobunaga recognized the weapon's potential and transformed their armies. They developed tactics that utilized large formations of Ashigaru musketmen firing in disciplined volleys, a strategy famously employed at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. This hail of lead could shatter traditional samurai charges and render the individual skill of an elite warrior largely irrelevant. Following the unification of the country, the Tokugawa shogunate established a lasting peace that would endure for over 250 years, from 1603 to 1868. This era, known as the Edo period, was a time of profound social change. With no major conflicts to fight, the samurai class was forced to transition from active duty warriors into a hereditary caste of civil administrators, bureaucrats, and courtiers. Their martial skills, once essential for survival and advancement, were now largely ceremonial. It was in this long peace that the katana began its ascent from a battlefield sidearm to the preeminent symbol of the samurai identity. As the practical application of combat faded, the practice of swordsmanship was transformed. It evolved from a purely martial art into a sophisticated discipline for moral, spiritual, and personal development. Great sword masters like Miyamoto Musashi authored influential treatises that explored the deep philosophical dimensions of their art. They connected it with the principles of Zen Buddhism and the pursuit of a clear mind. The sword became a tool not for taking a life, but for perfecting one's own, and swordsmanship was reframed as a path to enlightenment. While the great weapons of the battlefield, the bow, the spear, and the matchlock, were stored away in armories, the sword remained a constant presence in the samurai's daily life. By law, only samurai were permitted to wear the daisho, the iconic pairing of the long katana and the shorter wakizashi. This set of swords became the ultimate status symbol, an immediate and visible marker of one's privileged position at the top of the social hierarchy. To draw one's sword in public was a grave offense, a far cry from the constant combat of the Sengoku period. It was during this era of peace, when the sword was carried but rarely used, that the idea of the katana as the soul of the samurai was truly born and codified. This reveals a central paradox of this weapon. The katana's symbolic power grew in inverse proportion to its actual utility. It became the most important weapon in the samurai's mind, precisely because it was the least important on the battlefield. The bow and spear, being purely utilitarian instruments which weren't carried around daily, lost their relevance and faded into the background in an era of seemingly everlasting peace. The sword, however, as both a personal sidearm and a legally mandated emblem of class, was perfectly positioned to absorb the entirety of the samurai's martial ethos. Further, when samurai in this period did involve themselves in actual combat, it was generally through formalized duels, or through brief actions to restore peace in the town or countryside. These were both instances where the katana would have found usage, since samurai weren't simply walking around carrying arquebuses, for instance. It became the focal point of their identity, not because it was the greatest weapon, but because it was the only weapon that remained central to their pacified lives. The final transformation of the katana from a status symbol into a global icon occurred as the samurai class itself faced its demise. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 ushered in an era of rapid modernization and westernization. The new government, determined to create a modern nation-state, systematically dismantled the old feudal structure. The samurai class, seen as an anachronism, was formally abolished, though many leading figures still came from this class. The final symbolic blow came in 1876 with the Sword Abolishment Edict, which banned the public wearing of swords. This act officially ended the age of the samurai, stripping them of their most cherished and visible privilege. Yet, as the real samurai faded into history, the myth was just beginning to take shape. In yet another paradoxical turn, the modernizing Japanese state repurposed the now obsolete sword as a powerful nationalist symbol. To foster a unique martial identity and distinguish Japan from the Western powers it was emulating, they promoted a romanticized version of Bushido and the katana. During the rise of Japanese imperialism in the 1930s, officers in the Imperial Japanese Army were issued swords designed to look like traditional katana. These weapons were mass-produced in factories and necessarily didn't carry the workmanship associated with the traditional katana. Those who were from samurai families were encouraged to raid their family treasury and wear these swords, many of which were hundreds of years old. These acts were a deliberate act of propaganda, an attempt to connect the modern soldier to the spirit of the idealized samurai warrior of the past. These mass-produced katana, for their part, became a common trophy taken by American soldiers, and I'm sure some of you watching this have one in your house right now. During the Allied occupation, all forms of media romanticizing feudal values were banned, and katanas were seen as an item which promoted nationalism. However, in response to the rising red tide in Japan, the Allied occupation lifted the restriction on this ban, hoping to utilize the power of nationalism against the Soviets. From here, Akira Kurosawa would go on to create cinematic masterpieces such as The Seven Samurai and Yojimbo. These films would combine with the spiritual current espoused by Musashi, and from this something new would emerge. It was the powerful image of the samurai as sword-wielding philosophers with superhuman abilities with the blade. This is an imagined reality, further compounded by a romanticized code of Bushido that would inspire such staples such as the Jedi. From this point, the legend of the samurai and the focus on the katana as their primary armament would grow exponentially, and the rest, as they say, is history.